Good evening, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 70. Today we have our guest speaker, Vicky Hart, and I'll be passing over to Vicky shortly. And I'm going to pass over to you, Siobhan, just to give people a bit of time to still come in, but so we don't lose any time, really.
Tonight we are looking at we're really about extending our anti-racism series. So we started off, one of our very first webinars was an introduction to anti-racism and the theory and practice around it. And since then, every season we've had a couple of webinars that have considered anti-racism, extending the conversation, widening out the debate, for example. And Vicky's joined us previously when we had a session which looked at widening the debate around anti-racism, and it was such a popular night that everybody wanted us to ask Vicky back and also to ask June back. So we had like the two guests we had three guests that night, and two of the guests are coming back to do a full webinar, and so I think June's coming back in a month or so's time. But Vicky's joining us to talk to us tonight about anti-Semitism in social work, which is such a topical topic. It's so relevant at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to learning. I know I learned loads when Vicky was with us last time. I love the webinars where they're led by somebody and I can just sit back and make some notes. So I'm going to sit back and make some notes tonight. I'm just going to hand straight over to you, Vicky, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Siobhan. Thank you to all the team, and thank you all for attending. So I'm going to talk, as Siobhan said, about anti-Semitism and social work, and it is very much from a personal perspective. I'm a social worker, and I'm going to do something a little bit different. You will hear about, I will do my introduction, I promise. But before I even go into my introduction, I just wanted to put these questions up for you to think about. I'm not going to answer these questions for you, but I want you to hold on to these questions through the talk that I'm doing and think about really, what does it mean to be anti-racist? And what does it mean to have anti-racist social work practice? And yeah, hold on to some of those thoughts and perceptions and thinking about, what does race mean? And also what the impact is of racism. Some of you will, I know, sadly have that experience, but just how you think about it and who decides who those terms are defined by. And I'm coming from this really from a position of thinking that while race can be described as perhaps a socially constructed concept in the fact that, you know, things that are different between us are kind of not necessarily kind of biological, you know, we're no different in terms of, you know, these are kind of ways that people are divided, certainly not based on science or fact, but racism can sometimes be defined by the people who hold racist views. So while races, you know, is a concept, as I say, that may not be real in that sense, certainly not in terms of differences, in terms of value to humanity, in terms of being parts of community and the value to the community, racism as it's experienced obviously is very real, and it can impact through decades, through centuries and through millennia. And so I'm not saying that I'm right. These are some perceptions that I've made, but just it's useful, I think, to hold on to those thoughts as we go in another talk. So now you get my introduction, and I thank you all for really so much for joining us today. It's really just such a privilege to be here, and I really hope you find this interesting. I want to start by saying that whenever I talk about being Jewish and whenever I talk about anti-Semitism, these are very much my views. We have a saying, and I think there are similar in different cultures, that when you have two Jewish people in a room, you'll have three opinions. So really emphasizing that I'm not trying to speak for all Jewish people. And even if I wanted to, they'd very quickly shout me down, because we are very much a people of many views, and we do like to argue with each other. That is something that is very much a part of my cultural heritage. So who am I apart from that? I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for over 20 years now. I'm based in London, and I've mostly worked in London. I've worked across a variety of adult services, mostly in mental health, but also in adult services before that. I've been an AMP, I've been a best interest assessor. And as of just a few months ago, I'm currently working at Social Work England as regional engagement lead at London, but just kind of emphasising, if I need to, that this talk is very much in my own time and it's not linked in any way to my employment. And I'm also Jewish. And so these two facts about me, they're unconnected in some ways, but they're both very much a fundamental part of who I am. So a little bit about kind of, I guess, how I grew up, because I think, as I say, there's lots of ways that, you know, one can express that Judaism. So I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family. I grew up, I often say, people say, where did you grow up? And I usually say in the north of England. And the reason that I'm not that kind of clear about that is because I spent some years in Leeds and some years in Manchester. So between, and I know I don't sound like it, people do tell me that, but I did grow up between Leeds and Manchester. So and we were as a family very well embedded with the local community, the people that I grew up around. We went to synagogue every week. I attended Jewish schools. Most of my friends and most of the people I mixed with when I was growing up were Jewish. We talked about, leading in about traditions. We didn't do Christmas in my house. I was very jealous and envious of all the things I saw on the television about Christmas. And so, you know, we had our own festivals, which I love and enjoy, but, you know, you always kind of think, it's like looking over, is the grass greener on the other side? And so these parts of my identity, the social work and the being Jewish, they're both really, really integral parts of who I am. And some of those aspects of our characters and our personalities and who we are immutable, and some we choose. So I chose to be a social worker, but I didn't choose my Jewishness. Whatever I believe, whatever I practice or don't practice, it is really very much a part of me. It's a part of the culture, the community and the heritage that I grew up with. Why do I want to talk about this? Because there is rising anti-Semitism in this country. It's something that I've always grown up with. We grow up learning about this as we're younger, that there always have been and there always will be people that hate us because we are Jewish, and to always be aware of that. So, but as I've seen it growing, I felt increasingly a need to talk about it. So while I spent probably about 15 years of my social work career not mentioning that I was Jewish because it didn't come up in conversation, because I took some of the festivals off as annual leave and I didn't really think it mattered. Increasingly, I have spoken up because I've realised, and you'll see a little bit in the slides later on, it is quite a small community, and I don't think when you grow up with it, you realise how small it is. So it's I feel an obligation to talk about it, because while I don't think I'm the best Jew in the world, not in any ways, it's my world. It is a world that I know. And so that's why. So this was a little bit exercise I did of thinking, what makes a community? What does being part of a community mean? And these were some of the things I came up with. Now, it could be one of these things. So a community can be the community on the street you live. So that's the geography, or it could be the town you live in, but it could also be, you know, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of history. And I'm not going to read them all out, but these are all just different aspects I was thinking about what makes community. And some of those may be shared and others may not be. So as I say, in your street, none of the other issues could be shared, but there'd still be a geographic community. And I think when I think about Jewish communities around the world, some of these things we share. For example, we wouldn't share geography, for example, but there is a shared history that binds us. And as far as belief is concerned, I think it's really important, because a lot of people would think for very obvious reasons, that it's a religion that binds us. But I don't think that's entirely accurate. I was reading something the other day that said, you know, Jewish people are very good at being atheists. So, you know, there are a lot of completely secular Jews, and that sense of belonging and being Jewish would be as important to a secular Jew as to the most observant religious Jew. So it's not always about religious practice. Sometimes it can be described as an ethno-religion, but I personally find that a little bit of an awkward word, because it's not really that easy to understand. The way I think about it is that we're trying to fit our culture into westernized language. So it doesn't quite fit in with the language that we talk about when we talk about ethnicity or race or religion. It could be little bits of all of those. So, for example, you know, these are the ways I've used people and nation, because this is the way, some of the ways that Jewish people historically would describe this grouping, who we are. We'd talk of ourselves, for example, I mean, in Hebrew, the Hebrew would be Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. It's a very crude translation, but it doesn't quite fit into the Western conceptions. And then the other thing that's really important is that people can convert to Judaism. And and it's really important within the religion that people who convert are seen as exactly the same as somebody born into the religion. So, you know, when you're looking at kind of ethnicity in that way, it doesn't fit, but there's no word that quite fits. And as I say, we think about it as being a people. There are these ties that bind us. And I should just mention, I talked about conversion, that Judaism, it's not a proselytizing religion. It's not an easy process to become Jewish, although it is possible. And I think sometimes when people think religion and think Judaism, they think of it within their own conceptions of, for example, how it might be in Christianity, where it might require a baptism or attendance at church. Whereas with the Jewish community, there is this shared culture, history. One can't just turn up and say, I would like to be Jewish, please. It's a little bit more complex than that. That's probably not the greatest description, but it's just it's a lot. There's a lot in there about difference. So here I tried to speak about some of the differences, and this was my attempt to find pictures of Jewish people, famous Jewish people, who looked very different, who one might not think. And it was to kind of give that breadth of Jewish people looking very different. There's no one way Jewish people look. And if you're interested, you might be into who the pictures are. Some of them you might spot. I probably didn't do a great job with some of them. There's Sir Anish Kapoor, who is a sculptor. There is Harold Pinter. There is Camille Pissarro, painter. Poor old Abraham Maslow. I could not find a picture of Abraham Maslow. So I've used his hierarchy of needs, sorry, Mr. Maslow, and Pink. And this was just to give a sense of that variety and range of no typical look of Jewishness. And the Jewishness that connects us can sometimes, as I've said, be hard to define. And one of the kind of issues, I think, that has caused a lot of the hatred that's been directed to Jewish people over the millennia, as I'll go through, has been not looking different sometimes from the host communities. This hiding in plain sight kind of feeling, and that was why the need for the yellow stars. Jews need to identify them in some ways. But I wanted in the slide just to capture some of the diversity, the wonderful diversity of Jewish communities, and that Jews don't look one way or speak one way. We are as diverse as the world is. So before I'm still kind of on my introduction bit, please bear with me. So I wanted to explain as well why we sometimes, and you would have seen I've used this in the presentation, I've used anti-Semitism without the hyphen. And and there is a really specific reason for this. The word anti-Semitism itself was a word that was coined in the 19th century by a German scholar, and I use that word with reservation because this was a man who wanted a word to describe hatred of Jewish people because he understood them to be a different and inferior race. The word anti-Jewish didn't work for him because it wasn't, he wanted to make it clear it wasn't about the religion. And equally, Judeophobe didn't do the job. It was really about him wanting to see the Jewish people as having an impure bloodline that was inferior. And that was where this word came from. It's nothing to do with Semitic, because Semitic does not describe a people, it describes a group of languages. There is no Semitic race. There are people who use Semitic languages. So the dropping of the hyphen is a really vague attempt to reclaim the language, which doesn't always work. It's kind of just to remember for us as well that this language was created by somebody who wanted to destroy us and almost succeeded, because his views were the basis of much of this Nazi genocidal ideologies. So removing the hyphen, it's not much, but it kind of emphasizes for us that this is a created word and that it was, as I say, created just to describe Jew hate on the basis of perceived race. So now I'm going to just show a little video. Before I show it, quick note that the Community Security Trust produced this video. The Community Security Trust is an organisation in the UK. It's a Jewish community organisation which provides help and support to Jewish people and Jewish institutions really around security and safety. So you might hear of talk about security guards at synagogues. When I go, there's always guards there. At my schools and schools now, there'll be guards at the school. And the support is provided through the Community Security Trust. So I'm going to play the video, captured a bit of a summary. So a little bit about Jewish community around the world here. And you can see, I mean, these numbers, by the way, really difficult in terms of accurate numbers because I say for reasons which I think might be obvious, Jewish people can be quite reluctant to be counted. So very difficult, I think, to get the information from censuses. So for example, in the UK, often the community have been consulted about whether to include Jewish people as a separate ethnicity, and generally the Jewish community will come back and say, no, thank you very much. We do not want the government to have the information about about being, that we're Jewish, because we've seen what's happened in the past. So there might be a bit of an underestimation of these figures. It depends where you've get the figures from. Roughly 15 million Jewish people in the world. You can see the majority, these countries are the top 5 countries in terms of Jewish population in the world. So obviously majority between the USA and Israel, but then we move down, France, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland, because there are 400 Jewish people in Northern Ireland. And in terms of proportions of the population, Israel 76%, but then we move to the USA about 1.4%. 1.3% in France, 1% in Canada, and we get to 0.5% of the community in the UK. So we are talking about really, really small proportions of the population. Just as a comparator, in 1939, the number of Jews in the world was 16 million. So we're not yet at the level of 1939 in terms of population in the world. And this is most stark in Europe, where currently the estimated population is around 1.3 million Jewish people in Europe, and there were 9.5 million Jewish people in Europe in 1939. And in the UK, you can see the vast majority of the Jewish community are in London, followed by Manchester, and then we go Leeds, Glasgow, Brighton and Hove. There are other larger communities, but it is in volume order. So there's certainly a community in Birmingham I know of. Leicester has a small community. My mother's family were from Edinburgh. These are some of the smaller communities. Cardiff and Swansea have communities, and as I say, very small community in Northern Ireland. But these are the largest communities that there are in the UK. So my next slide, I'm laughing a bit because this was my my attempt to capture millennia of Jewish history in one slide. I didn't make a very good job of it, as you'll see. So what I was trying, I mean, it's really, really hard, and I don't want to dwell on this too much because I could talk about this one slide for 3 hours probably, but just really, really kind of zipping through from biblical times to the destruction of the first temple in around 587 BCE before the Common Era, or BC before Christ, which we don't tend to use in Jewish circles. But this was the beginning of the diaspora, the first dispersal of Jewish people, a couple of generations, and then Jews were able to return, rebuilt the temple, second temple in Jerusalem, and the rebellion and the destruction of the second temple by the Romans. And at that point, really, much of the Jewish community dispersed around the world, although there did remain residual, some Jewish people remaining, but that's where you get the kind of splits into the different groupings of Jewish people, so with some slightly different traditions. So for example, you have the Ashkenazi tradition, which would be the Jewish communities that came up through Eastern Europe, the Sephardi communities, which went towards Spain and Portugal, and then moving on to North Africa, the Mizrahi community, which were the Jewish communities that stayed within the Middle East mostly. I'm being really broad here. And then the Beta Israel communities that were in Ethiopia. There were also communities in India, communities in China. I really, as I say, it's just too much to capture, but just to get a sense that there are these different traditions. And unfortunately, as there was a dispersal, now this was my attempt to run through some of the places where Jews were expelled from and run out of over the year. And I started in 250, got through France, got through Spain. We're going through the Middle Ages. We're getting on to the period of there's England, hello England. We're getting on to the periods of the Crusades here, where a lot of Jewish people were targeted, being infidels. So there was a lot of the massacre of Jews. You were getting some of the blood libels coming up at this time. I'll come more onto the British history in a minute, but we're going through the medieval times. We're going through the periods of the plague, where Jews again were blamed for the plague, and all sorts of, each one of these places are places that Jews were run out of. And then I got tired, to be honest, and realized that I couldn't get through them all, and these no means exhaustive, and just ended up in a whole big batch of them. This is where everywhere else was where everywhere else where Jews were expelled from. But what you get a sense is, and this is very Europe centric, and I was going to say I make no apologies for that, but I do make some apologies for that, because this is just one part of Jewish history, but it's my Jewish history. My family are from the European communities, from Ashkenazi backgrounds. So, but what you see, I think what is important to get a sense of is a group of people, a communities that went from place to place to place to place, being massacred, being thrown out, and having that sense of never being able to stop. And on to the British history of Jewish people. So Jewish people first noted to come to the UK the UK to England, really, with the Normans coming over, settling in York, in Norwich, Oxford, Hull, Lincoln, some of those old cities. Employment was restricted at the time to often Jewish people working as money lenders, which is where some of this later kind of perceptions of Jewish people and being linked to money came in. Medieval Jews were actually the property of the king, and they could be mortgaged. That was something interesting I found out while doing some research. And it meant that the king offered some additional protections to the Jewish people so that they, I mean, this is in England, so they weren't part of the feudal systems, for example. They were directly owned by the king, but that meant that they had higher taxes to pay. And for example, Jews were forced to pay for many of the Crusades. They paid the ransom for King Richard I when he was kidnapped. The picture, if you are aware or may not be, is Clifford's Tower in York, because it's a really famous site, or at least famous. I don't know how famous it is outside Jewish community. I think it's, if you go there, you'll see it. But it was, there was a massacre of the Jewish community at Clifford's Tower, where the mob turned on the community, and many killed themselves rather than being forcibly converted. But eventually that led to the expulsion of Jews in 1290 from England. The Jewish community returned in the 17th century with Cromwell. There's some records of that. The establishment of the first synagogue in England was in 1705 with Bevis Marks, which you can visit still. It's a lovely place in the city of London. And it's actually the oldest continually used synagogue in Europe. And without wanting to be too grim, the reason is because so many synagogues have been completely destroyed, of course, and there are no Jewish communities in a lot of the places that would have had older communities in Europe. So it is the oldest continually used synagogue. And the community, as they came over, they established the Board of Deputies, which you might have heard of, which is basically a representative group for the Jewish community. And then finally in 1753, with the Jew Bill, Jewish people were allowed to take citizenship. And in 1858, Jews were able to sit in Parliament for the first time, as the obligation to swear on a Christian Bible was removed. And so it allowed other people, it allowed more diversity, I don't know how much diversity there was at that time, into Parliament. At the time, in the 19th century, mass immigration really from Eastern Europe, with the pogroms, with Jews being run out of Eastern Europe. That's when a lot of my family came over, actually. And the Jewish community grew from 48,000 in 1880 to 250,000 in 1919. And you see, I've put it on the slide, but 1905 Aliens Act was actually the first immigration legislation passed in the country, and it was passed specifically to stop and limit Jewish immigration. And then there was more immigration fleeing from the Holocaust, fleeing from the Nazi regime. About 40,000 Jewish people coming to the UK at that period. There were internment camps for Jewish refugees set up on the Isle of Man, actually. But a lot of Jewish people came to join family. But there was also, you might have heard of the Kinder transport, where unaccompanied children were able to come in for a period. Although, just to note that their parents were not allowed to come in. And I'll come on to that a little bit later as well. But I'm going to move on. That was a really, really quick rush through history. And I apologise for that. And I'm going to move on to talk about different types of anti-Semitism now. And these definitions it's a book I read, Freeman 2021, but there are different ways of categorising. So it's not, it can be done in different ways. But these are kind of, as I say, some different manifestations of anti-Semitism. So there are what can be classed as the blood libels. That's a really broad term. So the actual blood libels came from medieval times, which were accusations of Jews using the blood, often blood of Christian children, in rituals, and which led to populations turning on them. So obviously it wasn't true. It was an attempt to create, a target in times of uncertainty, find a common enemy. And so these blood libels were often used for that. But in this sense, and since I'm using it here, it's really about these accusations of Jews causing physical harm. So, for example, Jews being responsible for 9/11 is one current manifestation. In medieval times, it was Jews being responsible for the plague. And currently, and you'll see I've got a slide, I think, coming next about Jews being responsible for coronavirus. These are different manifestations of these old blood libels. The next ones are around economic harm that Jews caused, or you might have heard, I've heard in specifically in social, while I've been sitting in social work offices, all Jews are rich. Jewish people control the banking. The Jewish lobby is, funding X, Y, or Z. All Jewish people are middle class. That came from a social work lecturer. And these some of them stem from that historical idea, history of Jews working as money lenders. But some of it is just about conspiracy theory. You might have heard of people making comments about Soros, about the Rothschilds. These are all kind of built into these economic anti-Semitism. The social anti-Semitism, that was really kind of trying to capture some of these more broader kind of talk about power being having this, Jewish people controlling the media, you might have heard, controlling show business and Hollywood, and these kind of senses, or Jewish people being damaging to the social structure. That's another one that comes up. And finally, the racial anti-Semitism, and a lot of this was really predominant in the 19th century, which saw Jewish people as having impure blood, Jewish people being targeted by white supremacists, and this hatred which targets the ethnicity of Jewish people, regardless of what we think our ethnicity might be. They make that assumption, and that's what I mean by racists sometimes defining racism. They don't link it to belief. It doesn't matter what the Jewish person believes. It doesn't matter. And the Nazis were really clear about this. It didn't matter, if you had Jewish grandparents, as far as they were concerned, you were Jewish. And all of these types of anti-Semitism can bind up in conspiracy theories. Now, until 2 days ago, I had a different picture for this slide, but I found this picture 2 days ago, and I thought, let's make it current. So every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. There we go. So this is just from 2 days ago that I saw. So some of these conspiracy theories you might have heard. I laugh about the Jewish space lasers, and I really shouldn't. But QAnon, you might have come across. And there was this theory coming a couple of years, I don't know, I've lost track. It was when the election was with Trump, but related to a conspiracy in the United States, which actually sounds really funny because it was saying that Jewish people were responsible for the California wildfires because they were fired lasers from space. And it makes me laugh, but then it makes me laugh until I stop and I think, people believe it. People actually believe it. People believe this literature that goes out. You only have to look at some of the stuff that comes, David Icke is a big one, some of the stuff from, well, I won't go through it, but it's not hard to find. It's not hard to find, filtered around everywhere. Say this leaflet. Jewish people controlling, I've talked about it, controlling the press, controlling banking, having different agendas to normal, in inverted commas, people, having dual loyalties to Israel. So a Jewish person can't be loyal to the country in which they were born. That was a big part of the Nazi push. So just these, so much of this is caught up in anti-Semitism. And kind of part of that I just wanted to talk about was some of these cultural representations of hatred, some of the texts, of the literature we grow up with, or I grew up with in this country, and not necessarily picking up some of the deep, deep anti-Semitism vested in it. So I've got some pictures here. So Svengali by George in a book by du Maurier, is literally described as a manipulative and mysterious Central European Jew. And when you think about some of the ways the language is used, it's really tied up with some of those anti-Semitic ideas. We've got, Fagin from Oliver Twist, forcing children to commit the crimes for him, and all that avaricious nature. Shylock from The Merchant of Venice. Now Barabbas from The Jew of Malta. Barabbas, Jew of Malta, I'm just looking at it. Christopher Marlowe, and I'm quoting here, it's possibly the first ever stage portrayal of a psychopath in English literature. Barabbas takes people into confidence by playing on their desires and killing them. There's a lot of thought that actually parts of Shylock was based on the characterization of Barabbas, because if you remember the English history slide, you'll know that there were no Jews in England at the time that both Marlowe and Shakespeare were writing. And then the Prioress's Tale in the Canterbury Tales, which tells the story of a devout Christian child murdered by Jews, affronted at his singing a hymn as he passed through the Jewish quarter of the town. You can't really get much more explicit than that. But I wanted to bring a few more examples, actually. One is T.S. Eliot, beloved poet, really explicit anti-Semitism in some of his writings. And I'm just going to read a little verse from his Gerontion, but there's loads of examples. My house is a decayed house, and the Jew squats on the windowsill. The owner spawned in some estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. And then, this is still published. There was a radio show a few years ago on Radio 4, which happily read the T.S. Eliot poetry. He's such a great poet. Roald Dahl, beloved. This is a little excerpt from an interview in 1983. There is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Maybe it's a kind of a lack of generosity towards non-Jews, he carefully explained. There's always a reason why anti-anything crops up anywhere. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason. And that was, really, his family have actually apologized for his anti-Semitism, but it was all done very quietly, and it still kind of makes me feel a bit uneasy, because I loved his books as a child, but knowing how much he hated me kind of still rests with me. Agatha Christie is another one. Dig at Jews in one of her books, Lord Edgware Dies. Poirot asked Hastings if he knew a secondary character, Carlotta Adams, was a Jewess, because she is shrewd and she is something more. Hastings acknowledged he had detected faint traces of Semitic ancestry, and this led Poirot to respond by saying that this trait makes for success, but can also lead to danger due to a love of money. Interesting about Agatha Christie is that when her books were published in the United States, all the anti-Semitic references were removed, and you'll see the difference in the numbers between the numbers of Jews in the United States and in England. The anti-Semitism was happily published in the UK, but when it went to the United States, they removed some of it. So Thursday is Holocaust Memorial Day. And it's not a coincidence I'm talking about this topic today. When I give talks about anti-Semitism, which I have done sometimes, I often don't talk about the Holocaust, apart from just mentioning it in passing, because I'm not someone that was directly affected, except in the sense that all Jewish people are. My family has a branch on my grandfather's side where the line completely ends in Sobibor, the death camps, 1942. And I try really hard not to think about what they experienced, and I try not to think about what my grandfather, my great-grandfather must have made and of that, and how it must have played on their minds. But because it's Holocaust Memorial Day, I did want to pause, and I think I should start by saying that my learning about the Holocaust and learning within Jewish communities may be different from how those not directly affected might learn. I grew up in the 70s and in the 80s. As I said, we regularly attended synagogue, and I went to Jewish schools. And there were teachers I had, friends we had that had the numbered tattoos on their arms. Among my friends, I was one of the more unusual for having 4 grandparents born in the UK. But we grow up in the shadow of knowing and being around people who fled, people who lived through the period where 2/3 of all the Jewish people in Europe were killed. And not just killed, but intentionally murdered on the basis of being Jewish. And this wasn't about religious practice. This wasn't about the different beliefs. This was racism. So today, when people say that Jewish people don't suffer racism, I struggle with that. I think of those voices that can't speak up because they were murdered, intentionally murdered. And so it really is for the sake of that I ask for people to make a place for anti-Semitism in discussion of anti-racism. And it's relevant because this is within living memory. I know I meet people directly affected. This is not the far path. If you work with Jewish people, you need to understand what an impact this has. Now, I'm not going to talk about the horrors of the death camps or the death marches or of the selection or of, any number of examples I could talk about. And I hope you will have time this week to learn more. But I am going to talk about 2 conferences which decided the fate of the Jewish people, millions of Jewish people. And I think the resonance is really strong today. The first one is about the Évian conference in 1938, and this video will explain it. But while you're watching it, I really want you to think about this because there are some really important lessons from this for today. I'm going to play the video now. Yeah, I kind of just added that because I thought, I don't know how many people know, and I think it is really pertinent when we think about refugees and asylum seekers today, actually. The other conference I was going to refer to was the Wannsee conference in January 1942. We've just passed the anniversary of it, where the Nazis moved to decide that the solution to the Jewish problem was mass murder. Previously, there'd been the concentration camps were in existence, but this was about using gas, about getting rid of, about killing as many Jewish people as possible, with the purpose of total destruction of the Jewish people. Obviously, I've had to limit what I can share here, but I do want to tell you, mention this. I've mentioned it before I move on, that this affects every one of us. This happened within living memory. My grandparents, when I was growing up, told me always to be ready to flee, that we should always know where our passport was, and they literally had money under the bed because they feared the need to leave. There was talk that, this was more my parents' generation, not my generation, about learning a trade that doesn't depend on the language you speak, so that if you need to start in a new country, you can. And it may invoke disbelief when Jewish people talk about some of their fears of the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. But we are constructed on the experience of our parents and our grandparents and the many, many millennia before them. And this is why I think it is important for me to talk about Jewish experiences. And some of you will have heard me say this before, so forgive me. But I think it bears repeating. It's no coincidence that my name doesn't sound Jewish. My great-grandfather changed the family name to one that fitted in. He didn't want to have a necessarily identifiable Jewish name. My grandparents advised my parents to make sure that we all had names that wouldn't be distinguishable as Jewish names. So while I look and sound white British, my experiences, the experience that I hold of my family is different, because we have our history to guide us. And that's where I'm going to move on to next. So I'm now going to talk about some of the more personal experiences and some of the things that I've spoken of sometimes before within the social work world. And I do tell this story a little bit, so I hope you forgive me if you've heard it before, but it does triggered a lot of changes in my perception. So I mentioned at the start that I grew up in an Orthodox community. I went to Jewish schools, and this is very much a part of who I am. But when I moved into social work, I didn't really mention it at work. It wasn't relevant. As I say, I took annual leave when I had the festivals, but there was no reason to say anything to anyone. We're always a little bit cautious because you never know how someone might react. I worked in North London at the time. Colleague came back to a big open plan office and started ranting about the deceptive Jewish woman she'd visited. I was working in adult services, who said she didn't have any money, must have been hiding it somewhere. They all look after their own, various other things like that. And I kind of was a bit shocked. And then I thought, I didn't say anything because I was shocked, but nor did anyone else in the room. And I think that was really what I reflected on the more is, you know, I did eventually speak to the team manager, but it completely distanced me from the rest of the team. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I left that office not that long after. But every team, every organisation I've worked in since then, I've explicitly said that I'm Jewish, because I never want to overhear some of those things again. Now, of course, that hasn't worked, because of course I've overheard people making anti-Semitic comments. You can't not walking through the world. But at least I've kind of identified myself to my colleagues. So it's not necessarily the people that I come to know and like and trust who are making those comments. Would they make those comments if they didn't know? I hope not. But this is something I guess we all live with in the back of our minds. So yeah, so I mean, you know, my experience, again, really, really clear, my experiences are not the same as somebody who is visually different, you know, someone who has darker coloured skin. I'm not going to face any assumptions when I open the door to a room. I'm not going to have the issues of not being shortlisted for interviews. I have an English sounding name that doesn't identify me as different. I don't have an accent when I speak, but my experiences aren't the same as somebody who is white British. So I've talked too long, and just want to kind of, I guess, leave it on this, that anti-Semitism is complex and there are many views, but if a Jewish person tells you that they experience anti-Semitism, I'd just ask that your first response is to believe them. And I did want to finish really on talking about intergenerational trauma. Now, I've used this slide before, but it's because I can't really find a better way to do it. And I think it speaks to me. There's been quite a lot of research around intergenerational trauma. And this doesn't just affect Jewish people, but actually some of the research, a lot of the research has been focused on people, you know, second generation children of Holocaust survivors in terms of intergenerational trauma. And I think that's where I think about pulling it into practice, where it's really important. I grew up, as I say, being told, you know, always to have the suitcase packed, always to be aware of which of your neighbours would hide you and which would shop you. And because that's been the experience of my family in a very broad sense through the years. And so some of the other impacts, and this is certainly something I've seen a lot, is keeping the family history hidden. I only learned about my grandfather's family after his death, and about the connections with the family in Amsterdam that were taken to Sobibor. There is the shame of the living. If you think about the proportion, 2/3 of Jewish people were killed. That's always going to leave an impact on those that remain. This silence of the friends and collusion of neighbours, never quite knowing who you can trust. And then the impact being through hypervigilance. And I think this is where I'd ask for a bit of understanding. If you hear people talking about, I know there's been talk about kind of having the suitcase packed. Oh, don't be silly. It's not like Hitler. But if you grow up with that hypervigilance, then you never quite know where the next challenge may come from. The avoidance, a lot of people would hide the fact that they're Jewish, but completely remove themselves from the Jewish community. And I certainly know a number of people whose parents never told them that they were Jewish and only found out later because their parents wanted to protect them from that anti-Semitism. And then the guilt, one always lives with the guilt. So what I'd say in terms of working with Jewish people, and there, I mean, I think I just put a little quote on, I'm not quite sure why I put that quote on, to move from slavery to freedom and from darkness to light and despair to hope, the greatest Jewish story ever told. It's quite a nice quote. Still not quite sure why I put it on there. I think I wanted to end with hope. But given what I've spoken about, the way I'd advise working is just to be aware that people might not disclose their background to you, and be careful of some of the assumptions you might make about how someone looks, what you think Jewish people might look like. And for me, you know, I haven't spoken in detail here about Jewish people, what makes Jewish people different in terms of practice and customs, partly because they vary and partly because there are lots of places you can learn that information. And I've put some links on the last slide I'll go through if you do want to learn. But I just wanted to kind of, I guess, capture that why it's important there's an understanding, not just of what Jewish people have experienced, but that the Holocaust isn't the start and end of it. There's a lot more to that history and about knowing how Jewish people feel. And I hope you take that with you. And I'm finishing with a quote, which this is actually a really good book. I would recommend it. It's quite challenging. But there you go. Since ancient times, in every place they have ever lived, Jews have represented the frightening prospect of freedom. As long as Jews have existed in any society, there is evidence that, in fact, it wasn't necessary to believe what everyone else believed, that those who disagreed with their neighbours could survive and flourish, and even flourish against the odds. So it's a bit of that canary in a coal mine. And finally, these are some resources. Now, I don't know you don't have the links because you don't get the slides, but these, you can Google these. It was just some ideas. My Jewish Learning and Aish are both sites that will talk a lot about Jewish practice, about what it is to be Jewish. Anne Frank House and Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Israel, have a lot of resources about Jewish history. There is a Jewish museum both in London and Manchester. They have some great resources. And I've put those two books up, The Baddiels, Jews Don't Count, and Dara Horn's People Love Dead Jews. And just a final plug for the Anti-Racist Social Worker. I contributed a chapter, but it is far, far better than the chapter that I wrote. There's so much better than the chapter I wrote. So go out and read it and it'll teach you a whole lot more. And that, I think, is it. I'm just ending with the slides that are coming up next. I think I can finish at that point.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vicky. That was, well, people are saying in the chat already it was very emotive. So thank you very much for that. And you can see, you know, Samantha saying in the chat that was very powerful, giving us space to reflect on our views and thinking about our work. So I think that's just been really helpful. And I've learned loads, actually, just listening to what you've been sharing there, Vicky. That's been really helpful. Thank you. What we will do, Vicky, is if you give us the links to the resources that you had on the last slide there, the email that we send people in a follow-up at the weekend, the team work on it on a weekend and send that email out to people. We'll add the links into that so that people do get the links. If you
Excellent.
can,
Thank you. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah,
if you can let us have those, we'll send that out to people. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming back and I think widening out what you shared with us last time. I think it's been really helpful because it's given us a lot more of context, and it's also helped me, I think, to think more widely about not just anti-racist practice, but anti-oppressive practice, and thinking about drawing out lots of similarities around what you've said. So thank you very much for prompting our thinking tonight. Thank you. So as Vicky has put the slides up in terms of what we're doing over the next few weeks, you can see there that, and I've gone all the way down to the Wednesday in, when is it, 23rd of February. So these are, oh, it should say the 30th. Look, that final one is wrong. Wednesday the 23rd of February. There isn't a 30th of February, is there? I've obviously put that wrong. So it'll be the first week in March, whenever that is, that June is coming back and joining us. June was the other guest that was the first time that Vicky joined us, and she'll be looking at intersectionality and anti-racism. Next week, because it's the 2nd of the 2nd, 22, we thought, right, we really need to look at something around 2. So we're going to look at my social work placement. It takes 2. So it'd be particularly helpful for students and practice educators. The week after, we're going to be looking at professional curiosity. I think that's going to be a really important week, actually, for everybody involved in social work. And then we've got other sessions coming up around non-violence in social work conversations, keeping reflective journals. So there should be something for everybody there. So thank you again, Vicky, for sharing with us tonight, and good night to everybody. Hopefully see you next week. Goodbye and good night.